I shouldn't have done it. I should have let him sleep. I should have run the second his heart started beating again. Let the royal healers deal with the darkness rolling off his skin. The moment my fingertips brushed his skin and the silence of the room shattered. "Look at me, Elsa." The command in Ragnar's voice made my knees tremble. He didn't need to use his alpha tone. His presence alone was enough to pin me in place. He stepped into my personal space, his hand slamming against the wall beside my head, trapping me. The golden glow in his eyes was no longer the fading ember of a dying man. It was a forest fire. I was only trying to help," I whispered, my voice betraying my fear. "The healers said you were losing the fight. So you decided to break the ancient law? You decided to bridge our souls?" His fingers reached out, his thumb dragging across the pulsing silver mark on my collarbone. The mark I had accidentally branded myself with when I gave him that desperate kiss of life. His touch sent a jolt of electricity through me, a heat so intense it made my head spin. He leaned down, his lips brushing against my ear, his breath hot and demanding. "You've played with fire, little healer. You've tethered a king to a girl who was supposed to be invisible. Now you're mine. Do you have any idea what happens to the woman who belongs to a Lycan who has nothing left to lose?" He didn't wait for an answer. His hand moved to the back of my neck, tilting my head back to expose my throat. "The hunt has already begun, and I'm the only one who can decide if I'm your protector or your captor." Hello, my lovely pack. Welcome back to Ellen's Werewolf Romance Collection. I am so incredibly happy to have you here with me today as we dive into this brand new heart-pounding journey of fated mates and forbidden power. If you are enjoying the chemistry between Elsa and her king, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. It truly helps our community grow and ensures you never miss a single chapter of our stories. For those of you who want to dive even deeper into the pack and support the channel, I'd love for you to check out our channel membership options. We have some wonderful perks waiting for you there. I always love hearing from you, so please drop a comment below and let me know where in the world you are listening from today. Whether you're at home, on your commute, or tucked away in your own little sanctuary, I want to know. And as we go through today's story, feel free to engage and tell me your favorite parts. I love reading your reactions to the twists and turns. Now, let's get back to the story and see just how far Ragnar is willing to go to keep what is his. Chapter 1. The Invisible She-Wolf. The weight of the woven basket against my hip was a familiar ache, a constant companion as I navigated the treacherous, damp slopes of the Silver Mist Forest. Every morning before the sun managed to pierce through the dense canopy of the Shadowspire territory, I was out here, searching for the rare mosses and roots that kept our pack's infirmary stocked. It was a role I had carved out for myself, not out of a sense of duty to the Alpha, but out of necessity. In a pack where strength was the only currency, a she-wolf like me, whose beast was small and quiet, was viewed as a ghost among the living. I was the girl who cleared the tables and mended the tunics, the one whose name was only spoken when there was a chore that no one else wanted to touch. My stepmother, Kate, made sure that every waking moment of my life was occupied with service, her voice a sharp whip that reminded me of my place every time I dared to linger near the warmth of the communal fire. The morning light was a pale, sickly gray as it filtered through the ancient trees, illuminating the swirling mist that gave this place its name. I moved with a practiced silence, my feet finding purchase on the slick stones and tangled roots that would have tripped a less observant shifter. My wolf, though small, was attuned to the vibrations of the earth in a way the brawny warriors of our pack could never understand. I could hear the heartbeat of the forest, the slow respiration of the trees, and the frantic scurry of small prey beneath the leaf litter. To the Shadowspire, I was a runt, a girl of no account who added nothing to their military might. They did not see the way the plants seemed to lean toward my touch, or how I could find life-saving herbs in the middle of a barren winter. I was unnoticed, and in that lack of attention, I had found a strange kind of freedom. The deeper I ventured toward the forbidden wilds, the more the atmosphere changed. The usual sounds of the forest, the chatter of squirrels and the distant howl of a patrolling sentry, faded into an eerie, expectant silence. Most of my packmates avoided this boundary, fearful of the ancient legends that claimed the wilds were haunted by the spirits of the first shifters. But I felt no such fear. Instead, I felt a magnetic pull, a tugging sensation deep within my chest that grew stronger with every step I took toward the ravine. It was as if my very soul was being reeled in by an unseen tether, dragging me away from the safety of the marked trails and toward the jagged heart of the wilderness. My heart hammered against my ribs, not with terror, but with a frantic, desperate urgency that I couldn't explain. I stopped near a cluster of silver-leafed ferns, my fingers trembling as I reached out to harvest them. My stepsister's mocking laughter echoed in my mind, a cruel reminder of the bruises she had left on my arm just yesterday when I hadn't moved fast enough to fetch her water. They thought they could break me with their small cruelties, but they didn't realize that my spirit was forged in the quiet spaces they were too loud to enter. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves, but the air was heavy with something far more potent than the usual damp earth and wildflower blooms. There was a metallic tang in the breeze, sharp and jarring, that set my wolf on edge. It was the scent of blood, but not the copper-sweet smell of a deer or a rabbit. This was something darker, more powerful, and thick with the stench of a violent struggle. The pulling sensation in my chest suddenly flared into a sharp pain, forcing me to gasp for air. I dropped my basket, the carefully gathered herbs spilling onto the mossy floor, ignored as I began to run. My feet moved of their own accord, leaping over fallen logs and dodging low-hanging branches as I sprinted toward the edge of the ravine. The mist seemed to part for me, revealing a path that led straight to the precipice. I skidded to a halt at the very edge, my breath coming in ragged heaves as I peered down into the shadows of the gorge. The ground below was a chaotic mess of shattered stone and uprooted saplings, the evidence of a massive weight crashing through the brush. There, lying motionless in the shallow, red-stained water of the creek, was a wolf larger than any I had ever seen. His fur was the color of moonlight and winter storms, a brilliant silver that seemed to catch the meager light even in the depths of the ravine. He was covered in jagged wounds, his flank rising and falling in shallow, stuttering jerks that signaled the end was near. I knew instinctively that I was looking at something legendary, a creature that shouldn't exist in the peripheral world of the Shadow Spire. As I watched, the silver fur began to recede, the massive form shrinking and shifting until a man lay broken on the stones. Even from this distance, the sheer power radiating from him was staggering, a cold and regal energy that made the very ground beneath me tremble. I didn't think about the danger or the laws I was breaking. I only knew that the tether in my soul was screaming at me to reach him before his light went out forever. Chapter 2. Silver Blood in the Ravine. The descent into the ravine was a blur of sliding gravel and tearing fabric. I didn't care that the sharp rocks were shredding my simple tunic, or that my palms were beginning to bleed from the friction as I scrambled down the steep embankment. Every instinct I possessed was screaming at me to reach him. The magnetic pull in my chest had transformed from a gentle tug into a violent, rhythmic pulsing that matched the faltering heartbeat of the man lying in the shallow water below. My breath came in short, jagged gasps, but I didn't stop until my boots splashed into the crimson-tinted stream. The water was icy, chilling my ankles, but the heat radiating from the fallen figure was like a furnace, even as his life force ebbed away. Up close, the man was even more imposing than he had appeared from the ledge. He lay on his back, his broad chest heaving with the effort of every shallow inhalation. His skin was the color of pale marble, marred by deep, jagged gashes that looked as though they had been inflicted by the claws of a beast twice his size. This wasn't the result of a simple skirmish or a hunting accident. These were the marks of a calculated high treason ambush. There were remnants of silver-tipped arrows scattered among the rocks, the metal designed to burn and weaken even the strongest of our kind. I knelt in the mud beside him, my hands hovering over his wounds. I had spent my life treating the minor injuries of the Shadowspire warriors, but I had never seen anything this catastrophic. Then, I saw his face clearly. My heart stopped. I had seen his likeness on the minted coins and the tapestries of the great halls during the rare times I was sent to the trade markets. This was King Ragnar, the supreme sovereign. He was the man whose name was whispered with equal parts reverence and terror across the territories. He was known for being a cold, efficient ruler who had no room for mercy or weakness in his court. Seeing him like this, broken, bleeding, and vulnerable, felt like a sacrilege. I reached out, my fingers trembling as I brushed a stray lock of dark, sweat-dampened hair from his forehead. His skin was clammy, and the unnatural gray tint of his face told me he was slipping into the dark. The forest around us felt strangely hushed, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath to witness the fall of a monarch. I could feel the presence of his wolf, a massive, restless shadow lurking just beneath his skin, fighting a losing battle against the toxins in his system. I reached into my bag for the few supplies I had, but my movements were sluggish, hindered by the sheer weight of the energy vibrating between us. The tether in my chest was no longer just a feeling. It was a physical cord of light that seemed to bind my lungs to his. When his chest hitched and then failed to rise again, a wave of pure, unadulterated panic washed over me, drowning out my logic and my fear of his status. I pressed my ear to his chest, praying for the thud of a heart that refused to quit. There was nothing. The silence was deafening, a void that threatened to swallow the entire ravine. I couldn't let him go. It wasn't just because he was the king. It was because the moment I had found him, something inside me had recognized him. It was a recognition that went beyond packs or titles. My wolf was howling in the back of my mind, a mournful sound that demanded action. I looked at his blue-tinged lips and the stillness of his powerful frame, and I knew that my herbalism wouldn't be enough this time. I had to give him something more, something that belonged to the very core of my being. I shifted my position, straddling his waist and leaning over him, my hands framing his jaw. His face was a mask of regal agony even in unconsciousness. I closed my eyes, reaching deep within myself to that small, flickering spark of warmth I had always kept hidden, the part of me that the Shadowspire had tried so hard to extinguish. I felt it flare to life, responding to his silence with a desperate golden heat. I didn't know what I was doing, only that I couldn't let the world go dark for him. As I lowered my head, the air around us seemed to vibrate with a sudden localized storm of energy. I pressed my lips to his, intending to breathe my own life into his lungs. But the moment our skin met, the universe seemed to shatter into a million shards of light. Chapter 3. The Kiss That Woke the World. The moment our lips touched, I didn't just feel the exchange of air. It was as if a dam had burst inside my soul, releasing a torrential flood of golden energy that I never knew I possessed. The warmth started in the center of my chest and raced through my veins like liquid sunlight, pouring out of me and into the broken vessel of the man beneath me. I could see it behind my closed eyelids, a brilliant, shimmering tether of light snapping into place, weaving our lifelines together in a complex, indestructible web. This wasn't just a physical act of rescue. It was a soul transfer, an ancient and dormant power awakening within me to answer the call of a dying predator. The transition of energy was so violent that my entire body jolted, my fingers digging into the hard muscles of his shoulders as I tried to anchor myself. I felt his heart beneath my palms give a sudden, erratic thump, like a drum being struck in a deep cavern. Then another. The rhythm grew stronger, faster, fueled by the lunar aura that was surging from my spirit into his. I could feel his pain, the searing burn of the silver, the ache of the betrayal, and the cold, creeping darkness of the sickness that had been eroding his mind long before the ambush. I took it all into myself, neutralizing the venom with the sheer purity of the light I was channeling. It was exhausting, a draining of my very essence, but I couldn't pull away. I was the bridge between him and the living world. Suddenly, the stillness of the ravine was obliterated. A massive golden glow erupted from our point of contact, expanding outward in a shockwave that flattened the tall grass and sent the stream water spraying into the air like diamonds. The trees groaned under the force of the energy, their leaves shimmering with a temporary, ethereal brilliance. Inside my mind, I heard a sound like a great bell tolling, a resonance that signaled the completion of a bond that had been waiting centuries to be forged. My breath was no longer my own. We were breathing in perfect, synchronized harmony, his lungs expanding with the strength I was providing. Then, the man who was King Ragnar didn't just wake up. He exploded back into consciousness. His eyes snapped open, and they weren't the dull, fading color of a dying man. They were burning with a fierce, molten gold, the pupils blown wide as his wolf surged to the surface with terrifying intensity. Before I could even gasp or move back, his large hand shot up, his fingers clamping around my waist with the strength of an iron vise. The heat coming off him now was searing, a predatory fire that made my skin tingle. He didn't look at me with confusion or gratitude. He looked at me with a raw, primal hunger that made my heart leap into my throat. He sat up with a sudden, violent grace, bringing me with him so that I was pressed tightly against his broad, scarred chest. His other hand tangled in my hair, tilting my head back to expose my throat, his nostrils flaring as he took in my scent. I was frozen, trapped in the gravitational pull of his gaze. The silence of the forest was shattered as he threw his head back and let out a roar that was half man and half wolf. It wasn't a cry of pain or a call for help. It was a declaration of absolute, undisputed ownership. The sound was so powerful it felt like a physical blow against my ribcage, vibrating through the very marrow of my bones. Mine! The word wasn't spoken. It was ripped from his throat. A jagged, possessive command that echoed through the trees and surely reached the ears of every living creature for miles. The sheer force of his voice sent a flock of birds screaming into the sky, and even the wind seemed to die down in submission. He pulled me closer, his face burying into the crook of my neck as he let out a low, rumbling growl that vibrated against my skin. I could feel the mark on my collarbone beginning to burn, a brand of light forming under the surface, sealing the claim he had just made before the world. I was no longer the girl from the Shadow Spire. I was something else entirely, and the monster holding me had no intention of ever letting me go. Chapter 4. The Golden Tether. The roar still seemed to vibrate in the air around us, a haunting echo that refused to fade. Ragnar's grip on me didn't loosen for even a fraction of a second. If anything, he pulled me tighter against him, his fingers bruising the soft skin of my waist. I could feel the frantic racing of his heart against my own, a wild, galloping rhythm that spoke of a man who had just clawed his way back from the edge of the abyss. His scent was overwhelming now. The metallic tang of blood was being replaced by a dark, intoxicating aroma of thunderstorms and ancient earth. It was a heavy, masculine scent that seemed to coat my senses, marking me as his long before his words ever could. I tried to pull back just enough to look at his wounds, my mind still reeling from the medical emergency I had just witnessed. "You're hurt," I managed to whisper, my voice sounding small and fragile against the backdrop of his power. "The silver, the wounds on your side. You need to be still." But he didn't seem to hear me. His focus was entirely internal, his wolf-driven instincts overriding any sense of physical pain. He continued to nuzzle the side of my neck, his breathing heavy and ragged. Every time I moved, a warning growl rumbled in his chest, a low-frequency sound that told me any attempt to distance myself would be met with immediate resistance. The burning sensation on my collarbone intensified, and I looked down to see a faint, golden light shimmering through the fabric of my tunic. It was a soul brand, a mark of the fated bond that only appeared when a lunar aura and a Lycan king were perfectly aligned. To the rest of the world, I was a girl of no consequence, but this mark said otherwise. It was a visible tether, a glowing reminder that my life was now inextricably linked to the man who was currently holding me like I was the only solid thing in a crumbling world. I could feel his strength returning with every passing second, the energy I had given him acting as a catalyst for his supernatural healing. The deep gashes on his chest were already beginning to knit together, the silver-poisoned edges turning from black to a healthy pink. The sound of approaching footsteps shattered our private bubble. It wasn't the clumsy, heavy-footed movement of the Shadowspire hunters. This was the disciplined, synchronized march of elite warriors. Within seconds, the edge of the ravine was lined with men clad in black and silver armor, their weapons drawn, and their eyes scanning the terrain with lethal efficiency. These were the Royal Guards, the Black Crest Sentinels. When they saw the king sitting in the mud, covered in blood but very much alive, a collective gasp went up among them. They scrambled down the slope, their movements a blur of practiced precision, but they stopped several feet away, their eyes widening in shock at the sight of me. The lead commander, a man with a scarred face and eyes like flint, stepped forward, his sword lowered in a gesture of respect. "Sire," he breathed, his voice thick with relief. We feared the worst. The ambush was more extensive than we anticipated. We have secured the perimeter." He moved to assist Ragnar, but the moment he reached out a hand, the king's head snapped up. The golden fire in Ragnar's eyes was blinding, and his upper lip curled back to reveal elongated canines. He shifted his body, shielding me from the commander's view, his arm locking around me in a protective barrier. The commander froze, his eyes darting from the king's possessive stance to the glowing mark on my collarbone. The air between them crackled with tension, a silent communication passing between the ruler and his most trusted soldier. The other guards followed suit, their expressions shifting from concern to absolute awe. They didn't see a commoner girl. They saw the woman who had brought their king back from the dead, the one he was claiming with a ferocity that bordered on madness. One by one, the elite warriors of the Lycan realm dropped to one knee in the mud and blood of the ravine, bowing their heads in a silent, powerful tribute. Ragnar finally looked at me, his gaze softening just a fraction, though the possessiveness remained. He reached up, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw with a touch that was surprisingly tender given the raw power he exerted. "You," he rasped, his voice sounding like grinding stones. "You are the one who pulled me back." He didn't wait for my answer. He turned his attention back to his men, his voice regaining its royal authority even through the strain of his recovery. "Bring the transport. She comes with us. She stays at my side, and if anyone so much as looks at her without my permission, I will have their head." The commander bowed lower, and I realized with a jolt of terror and wonder that my life in the shadows was over. Chapter 5. The Black Crest Flight. The transition from the muddy floor of the ravine to the interior of the royal transport was like stepping into another dimension. The vehicle was a massive, sleek construct of dark metal and reinforced glass, designed to move through the forest with a ghostly silence. Inside, the cabin was lined with soft, charcoal-colored leather and lit by a dim amber glow that felt like a sanctuary after the chaos of the forest. Ragnar refused to let the medics touch him until we were settled into the wide, plush seat at the rear of the craft. Even then, he insisted I sit directly beside him, his hand remaining firmly anchored on my thigh, as if he expected me to evaporate the moment he let go. I watched through the tinted windows as the silver mist forest blurred into a smear of gray and green. My heart was still hammering against my ribs, a frantic little bird trapped in a cage of silk and iron. Just hours ago, I had been worrying about whether I had gathered enough mint for my stepmother's tea. Now I was sitting next to the most powerful man in the world, being whisked away to a citadel I had only heard of in stories. The contrast was staggering, and a part of me felt like I was drifting in a dream, waiting for the moment I would wake up back in my cold, drafty shed in the Shadowspire village. But the heat of Ragnar's hand and the dull throb of the soul brand on my neck were very real. Ragnar leaned back against the headrest, his eyes half closed as the fatigue of his ordeal finally began to catch up with him. Despite his exhaustion, his presence filled the cabin, making the air feel heavy and charged. He had stripped off his ruined shirt, and a medic was quietly tending to the remaining wounds on his side, though the man looked terrified to be so close to the king in his current state. I watched the play of muscles in Ragnar's chest, the way the light caught the silver scars of past battles. He was a map of violence and victory, a man who had survived 100 deaths, and yet he was currently seeking comfort in the proximity of a girl who had nothing to offer but a hidden spark. The silence in the cabin was thick, broken only by the low hum of the transport's engines and the occasional rustle of the medic's supplies. I felt Ragnar's gaze on me and turned my head to find him watching me with an intensity that made my breath hitch. He wasn't looking at me like a king looks at a subject. He was looking at me like a man who had found the missing piece of his own soul and was still trying to comprehend the weight of it. There was a vulnerability in his gold eyes that didn't match his reputation, a flicker of something that looked almost like relief. "What is your name?" he asked, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate directly in my chest. "Elsa," I whispered, my voice trembling. I had spent so long being a person of no account that saying my name aloud to him felt like a monumental confession. He repeated it, the syllables rolling off his tongue like a dark prayer. "Elsa." He shifted closer, his shoulder brushing mine, and for the first time, he let out a long, shuddering breath that sounded like a sigh of pure contentment. "For the last 3 years, my mind has been a storm. A constant, screaming rage that never stopped, even when I slept. The doctors called it a sickness of the spirit, a decay that no medicine could touch. I thought I was going to lose my mind before the winter was out." He paused, his fingers tightening slightly on my leg. "But the moment you touched me, the moment you gave me that breath," the storm went quiet. For the first time in years, I can hear my own thoughts. The honesty of his confession hit me like a physical wave. I realized then that I wasn't just a healer who had patched up his physical wounds. I was the anchor for his sanity. The lunar aura within me had reached out to the feral madness of his wolf and forced it into submission, providing a peace that he had given up on finding. I looked at his powerful hands and his regal profile, and I felt a surge of something that wasn't fear or duty. It was a deep, soul-shaking empathy. We were both outcasts in our own way, me and my pack, and him in his own mind. As the transport began its steep ascent toward the mountain peaks where the Ethelgard citadel sat like a crown of white stone, Ragnar reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind my ear. His touch was lingering, his eyes never leaving mine. "They will try to tell you that you are a guest, Elsa," he said, his voice dropping to a possessive growl that made my toes curl. "They will try to treat you like a commoner who did a good deed, but make no mistake. You belong in the Black Crest. You belong to me. And I will burn this entire kingdom to the ground before I let anyone take this quiet away from me again." Chapter 6. A Cage of Silken Stone. The Ethelgard citadel was not a building. It was a mountain carved into a monument of power. As the transport glided through the massive arched gateway, I felt the sheer scale of the white stone walls pressing in on me. The architecture was ancient and predatory, every spire reaching toward the moon like a jagged claw. Guards in shimmering silver mail lined the pathways, their faces obscured by helms, standing as motionless as statues. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass, my heart sinking as I realized just how far I was from the muddy paths and familiar herbal patches of my home. This place was a world of cold permanence, a sharp contrast to the life of seasonal survival I had known. It felt like a beautiful, terrifying cage. When the doors hissed open, the temperature dropped, the mountain air crisp and biting. Ragnar stepped out first, but he did not move more than a foot away. He waited, his hand extended toward me in a silent demand. I took it, my small fingers disappearing into his large, calloused palm. The moment we stepped onto the courtyard stones, a sea of servants and minor officials dropped into deep bows. The silence was absolute, broken only by the snapping of banners in the wind. I felt their eyes on me, curious, judgmental, and filled with a confusion that mirrored my own. I was dressed in a torn, dirt-stained tunic, my hair a tangled mess of leaves and sweat, yet I was being led into the royal heart of the empire by the king himself. We bypassed the great hall, moving through a series of winding corridors that grew more opulent with every turn. The floors were polished marble that reflected the glow of the flickering torches, and the walls were draped in tapestries depicting the history of the Lycan lineage. Ragnar didn't stop to acknowledge any of the officials who tried to approach him with scrolls or reports. His focus remained entirely on the path ahead and the woman at his side. We eventually reached a set of massive double doors made of dark oak and reinforced with silver filigree. This was the entrance to the royal wing, a place restricted to all but the king's most personal staff. The interior of the suite was a breathtaking display of luxury. The furniture was carved from rare woods, upholstered in velvet the color of a midnight sky. A massive fireplace dominated the main room, crackling with a warmth that finally began to seep into my chilled bones. Ragnar led me toward the inner chambers, stopping only when we reached a sprawling bedroom that looked out over the valley. He turned to me, his golden eyes scanning my face with an intensity that made me feel as though he could see every secret I had ever kept. He reached out, his thumb grazing the soul brand on my collarbone, sending a jolt of heat through my entire body. "This is where you will stay," he stated, his voice a low, possessive rumble that left no room for argument. "My personal attendants will bring you everything you require. Food, clothing, anything you desire is yours for the asking." I looked around the room, feeling a wave of vertigo. To a girl who had slept on a pallet of straw for most of her life, this was beyond comprehension. I tried to find my voice, to ask him why he was doing this, why he wouldn't let me go back to the healer's lodge where I belonged. "Ragnar, I don't fit here," I whispered, the words catching in my throat. "I am a commoner from a low pack. Your people will not accept me in these halls." He stepped closer, his shadow falling over me like a protective cloak. He placed both hands on my shoulders, his grip firm but careful, as if he were afraid I might shatter. "They will accept what I command," he growled, his wolf pushing against the surface of his skin. "You saved my life, Elsa. You are the only reason the storm in my head has stopped. I do not care about your rank or your pack's standing. To me, you are the most valuable person in this citadel." He leaned down, his breath warm against my ear as he whispered a final warning. "Do not think of leaving. The guards have orders to keep you within these walls, for your safety and for my peace. You are mine now, in every way that matters." Chapter 7. The King's Shadow. Days in the Citadel passed in a strange golden haze. While Ragnar was tied to his duties as the supreme sovereign, he was never truly gone. Even when he was across the fortress in council meetings, I could feel the tether of our bond humming in the back of my mind. It was a constant, low-frequency vibration that told me he was alive, that he was recovering, and that he was thinking of me. To my surprise, he didn't leave me to rot in the luxury of the royal wing. Every afternoon, like clockwork, he would appear to walk with me through the high gardens. These gardens were a marvel of botanical skill, filled with rare flowers that only bloomed under the light of the moon. Today, The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and orange. I was kneeling by a bed of star lilies, my fingers buried in the rich, dark soil. For a moment, I could almost pretend I was back in the forbidden wilds, searching for the herbs that defined my existence. The dirt under my fingernails was a grounding comfort in a world of silk and silver. I didn't hear him approach. His movements were too predatory, too silent for human ears. I only knew he was there when the air around me suddenly shifted, becoming charged with the scent of a gathering storm and dampened earth. "They told me I would find you here," Ragnar said, his voice closer than I expected. I looked up to see him standing over me, his regal robes discarded in favor of a simple black tunic that clung to his broad chest. He looked less like a king, and more like the wolf I had found in the ravine. He reached down, offering me his hand to help me up. I hesitated, looking at my mud-streaked fingers, but he didn't care. He hauled me to my feet, his touch lingering on my waist long after I was stable. He didn't let go, instead guiding me toward a stone bench overlooking the cliffs. "You have a gift for making things grow," he observed, his eyes tracking the way the lilies seemed to perk up in my presence. I shrugged, feeling the familiar prickle of shyness. "Plants are simpler than people," I replied. "They don't care about rank or strength. They only care if you listen to what they need." He went silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the distant mountain peaks. I could feel the restless energy of his wolf, the creature pacing within him, searching for a way to bridge the gap between us. He reached out, taking my hand in his and pressing my palm flat against the stones of the bench. "Close your eyes, Elsa," he commanded softly. I obeyed, the world going dark as my other senses sharpened. I could feel the warmth of his body beside me, the steady thrum of his heart, and the vibration of the wind. "Don't just feel the surface," he whispered, his hand covering mine, his fingers interlacing with my own. "Listen to the pulse of the earth. Everything in this kingdom has a rhythm. The stone, the roots, the water flowing beneath the mountain. My wolf hears it all, but it is usually a cacophony of noise. With you here, it becomes a melody." He pressed down, and suddenly, I felt it. A deep rhythmic throb coming from the heart of the mountain, a slow and ancient heartbeat that seemed to sync with the mark on my collarbone. The intimacy of the moment was staggering. We were connected not just by the bond, but by the very world around us. I felt a surge of the lunar aura within me, a soft, glowing heat that traveled down my arm and into his skin. Ragnar let out a low, rough sound that was almost a purr, his head dropping to rest against my shoulder. The supreme sovereign, the man the world feared as a cold-hearted tyrant, was seeking solace in the touch of a girl the world considered a runt. I turned my head, my lips brushing against his forehead, and for a heartbeat, the rest of the world ceased to exist. We were just two souls anchored in the dark, but the peace was shattered when a distant silver horn blast echoed through the valley, signaling the arrival of the neighboring alphas for the evening summit. Chapter 8. The Scent of Mint and Thunder. The great dining hall was a cavern of opulence that felt more like a battlefield than a place for a meal. Long tables of dark polished wood were laden with roasted meats, exotic fruits, and decanters of blood-red wine. The atmosphere was heavy with the competing scents of dozens of high-ranking shifters, the musk of aggression, the sharp tang of ambition, and the underlying rot of hidden agendas. I felt small and exposed in my gown of pale sage silk, sitting at the high table beside Ragnar. This was the first time I had been presented to the gathered alphas of the various territories, and the weight of their collective scrutiny was almost suffocating. I could hear the whispered comments from the lower tables, the sharp edges of their words cutting through the music. They spoke of the commoner who had bewitched the king, of the low-born runt who had no place at the supreme sovereign's side. My hands trembled as I picked up my silver fork, the metal feeling cold and heavy. I tried to focus on the scent of crushed mint I had rubbed into my wrists earlier, a small comfort from my herbalist days. But it was being drowned out by the overwhelming sensory assault of the court. I felt like a rabbit that had wandered into a den of lions, every instinct screaming at me to run back to the shadows where I was safe. Ragnar seemed to sense my distress without even looking at me. He was engaged in a tense conversation with an alpha from the northern wastes, his expression a mask of bored indifference. But his hand was resting on the back of my chair, his thumb tracing slow, rhythmic circles against the wood. Suddenly, he shifted his weight, his presence expanding until it seemed to fill the entire space around me. It was a deliberate move, a mental cloaking that wrapped me in the scent of thunder and ancient forests. It was as if he had built a wall of power between me and the rest of the room, dulling the sharp edges of the hostile scents and muffling the cruel whispers. "Eat, Elsa," he said softly, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "You need your strength." I looked at him, surprised by the directness of his care. He wasn't just protecting me from physical threats. He was shielding my very spirit from the toxicity of his own court. I took a small bite of the bread, feeling the tension in my shoulders begin to ebb away under the safety of his shadow. For a few minutes, I managed to find my footing, even offering a polite nod to the commander seated across from us. But the peace was short-lived. A sudden, sharp scent of old iron and bitter herbs cut through Ragnar's protection, making my stomach churn with a sudden, inexplicable dread. High General Draven sat 3 seats down, his cold, calculating eyes fixed on me with a predatory interest. He was a man of sharp angles and hidden depths, his presence a jarring contrast to Ragnar's raw, honest power. Draven raised his glass toward me, a thin, mocking smile stretching across his face. "A fascinating addition to our table, sire," he said, his voice carrying a silken threat. "It is rare to see a healer of such humble origins in the Black Crest. One wonders what other secrets the Shadow Spire has been hiding from us." The table went silent, the other alphas leaning in to see how the king would respond to such a blatant provocation. Ragnar's hand stopped its movement on my chair. The air in the room didn't just grow cold, it seemed to freeze entirely. He turned his head slowly toward Draven, his golden eyes narrowing until they were mere slits of molten light. The low, rumbling growl that started in his chest was a sound that made the glassware on the table vibrate. "Her origins are irrelevant, Draven," Ragnar replied, his voice a dangerous, quiet rasp. "She is the lunar aura. She is my mate. And if you ever speak of her with that tone again, I will ensure it is the last time you speak at all." The general's smile faltered, but the malice in his eyes didn't fade. He bowed his head in a mock gesture of submission, but as I looked down at my plate, I saw a drop of dark, oily liquid staining the white tablecloth beside my hand, a silent warning of the poison that was already beginning to circulate in the heart of the palace. Chapter 9. Who did this to you? The aftermath of the dinner left me feeling drained and hollow. Ragnar had escorted me back to our suite in a silence that was thick with suppressed rage. I knew it wasn't directed at me, but the sheer force of his anger was a terrifying thing to behold. Once the doors were locked and the guards were posted outside, he paced the length of the room like a caged beast, his muscles twitching with the need to shift and hunt. I stayed by the window, watching the moonlight dance on the mountain peaks, trying to pro Elsa the fact that I had just been publicly claimed by the king of all Lycans. The weight of the title Lunar Queen felt like a leaden crown I wasn't ready to wear. "I should have killed him where he sat," Ragnar growled, his voice cracking with the strain of his control. "Draven thinks he can test me because I have been focused on my recovery. He thinks your presence makes me weak." He stopped his pacing, turning to look at me, his gaze softening as it landed on my tired form. "He is wrong. You are the only thing that makes me strong enough to hold this kingdom together." He crossed the room in 3 long strides, stopping just inches from me. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the silk of my gown. "You are trembling, Elsa. Tell me what is wrong." "It's just... everything is so much," I whispered, looking down at my feet. "I'm not used to people looking at me, Ragnar. In my pack, being unnoticed was my only safety." As I spoke, I shifted my weight, and the silk of my gown pulled tight across my shoulders. I winced as a dull ache flared in the small of my back, a lingering reminder of a punishment I had received weeks ago from my stepmother for a minor transgression. Ragnar's eyes sharpened instantly, his predatory instincts picking up on my momentary discomfort. Before I could protest, his hands moved to the laces at the back of my dress, his movements efficient and undeniable. "What are you doing?" I gasped, trying to pull away, but he held me firmly in place. "Ragnar, stop!" He didn't listen. With a single fluid motion, he loosened the silk, pulling the fabric down just enough to expose the skin of my upper back. I froze, the cool air hitting my skin, feeling a wave of deep, burning shame. I knew what he would see. The skin there was a map of old, faded welts and jagged scars, the physical evidence of years of systematic mistreatment. They were the marks of a girl who had been used as a punching bag by those who were supposed to protect her. I kept my head bowed, waiting for the disgust I was sure would follow. The room went deathly silent. I expected him to say something, to ask why I was so damaged, or perhaps to turn away from the sight of such ugliness. Instead, I felt the temperature in the room plummet. Ragnar's breathing became a series of low, dangerous huffs. When I finally dared to look over my shoulder, I saw that his face had transformed. His eyes were no longer gold. They were a terrifying, solid black, the pupils having swallowed the iris entirely. His wolf was at the very surface, his claws extending and retracting as he stared at the scars on my back. His hand reached out, his fingers hovering just a fraction of an inch above the oldest mark, his touch trembling with a mix of reverence and murderous intent. "Who did this to you?" he whispered, and the sound wasn't human. It was the roar of a hurricane contained within a man's throat. I tried to pull my dress back up, but he caught my wrists, his grip like iron. "Elsa, give me the names." I looked into his dark, fractured eyes and saw a level of devotion that terrified me. He wasn't just angry. He was devastated by the thought of my pain. "It was my pack," I managed to say, my voice breaking. "My stepmother, her children. It was just how things were for a runt." Ragnar let out a jagged, pained sound, pulling me into his chest and burying his face in my hair. "They will pray for the mercy of death before I am finished with them," he vowed, his voice a promise of absolute annihilation. "Every hand that touches you in malice will be severed. I will make the Shadow Spire a graveyard for what they did to my mate." Chapter 10. The Moon Pool's Temptation. The following morning, the atmosphere in the citadel was taut with expectation. Ragnar had spent the night in a state of restless protective fury, refusing to leave my side for even a moment. However, the physical toll of his recovery and the mental strain of holding back his wolf were beginning to show. The obsidian decay, though halted by my kiss, still left a lingering weakness in his bones that only the sacred waters of the moon pool could soothe. This was a place of deep magic, a bathhouse carved into the very roots of the mountain where the lunar energy was at its strongest. Ragnar had asked me to accompany him, claiming he needed my presence to keep his beast grounded during the ritual. The moon pool chamber was a cathedral of steam and silver light. A massive, circular pool occupied the center of the room, fed by a waterfall that cascaded down a wall of translucent quartz. The water shimmered with an inner radiance, casting dancing reflections against the arched ceiling. The air was warm and heavy with the scent of ancient minerals and something that smelled like the first rain of spring. I stood by the edge of the water, my heart racing as Ragnar stripped away his outer layers. He was a vision of raw, masculine power, all hard angles, scarred muscle, and predatory grace. Even with the lingering shadows of the decay beneath his skin, he was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. "The water is cold at first," he said, his voice echoing in the vast space. He stepped into the pool, the silver liquid swirling around his waist. He looked back at me, his gaze heavy with a longing that made my knees weak. "Come here, Elsa. The bond is restless today. I can feel your heart beating faster than mine." I hesitated, looking down at my simple linen shift, but the pull in my chest was undeniable. I stepped into the water, the initial chill making me gasp, but as I moved closer to him, the warmth of his aura began to radiate through the silver depths. I waded toward him until we were standing chest to chest in the center of the pool. The steam curled around us, creating a private world where titles and kingdoms didn't matter. Ragnar reached out, his wet hands sliding up my arms to rest on my shoulders. The water seemed to amplify the connection between us, the lunar aura within me responding to the sacred energy of the pool. I felt a sense of profound peace wash over me, the fear and the shame of the previous night beginning to dissolve in the silver light. I looked up at him, my breath hitching as I realized how close we were. His face was inches from mine, his eyes searching my soul with a desperate, hungry intensity. "You are the only thing that feels real to me anymore," he whispered, his thumb tracing the curve of my bottom lip. "In this court, everything is a lie or a trap. But your light is the only truth I have left." He leaned in, his forehead resting against mine. The tension between us was a physical cord, pulling us closer until I could feel the heat of his skin through my damp shift. My hands found their way to his chest, my fingers curling into the hair there as I pulled him toward me. I wanted him to kiss me, not as a life-saving measure, but as a claim of the heart. The world around us blurred into a haze of silver and shadow as his lips finally brushed against mine in a ghost of a promise. We were a heartbeat away from losing ourselves in each other when the heavy stone doors of the chamber were thrown open with a violent crash. The sound echoed like a thunderclap, shattering the silence and the intimacy of the moment. Ragnar reacted instantly, his wolf surging to the surface as he swung around to shield me, his body tensing for a fight. A frantic guard stood in the doorway, his face pale and his armor dented. "Sire, forgive the intrusion," the man gasped, his voice trembling with terror. "The perimeter has been breached. The northern gate has fallen, and they are already inside the lower levels. It's an uprising, sire. Draven has moved sooner than we feared." Chapter 11. The First Gift. The chaos of the breach was handled with a surgical, terrifying efficiency that only the Black Crest Sentinels could provide. Ragnar had stepped out of the moon pool, his body dripping with silver water, and within seconds he was the commander of a war machine. He didn't even put on a shirt before he was barking orders, his wolf snarling just beneath his skin. It turned out the uprising was a small, coordinated group of mercenaries, likely a test of the Citadel's new security, and they were neutralized before they reached the royal wing. However, the atmosphere of the palace remained charged with a frantic electric tension. The peace of the bath was a memory, replaced by the grim reality that the throne was under siege from within. 2 days later, the Citadel was still on high alert, but Ragnar finally found a moment of quiet to summon me to his private study. The room was filled with the smell of old parchment and the metallic tang of polished steel. He was standing by the window, his back to me, silhouetted against the rising moon. When he turned, his expression was softer than it had been since the attack. He held a small, velvet-lined box in his hands, his fingers brushing the fabric with a strange sort of reverence. I stood by the door, still feeling like a guest who had overstayed her welcome, despite the mark on my neck that throbbed with every beat of his heart. "Elsa, come here," he said, his voice a low, beckoning rumble. I walked toward him, my steps silent on the heavy rugs. He opened the box, revealing a necklace that seemed to hold a piece of the sun within its craftsmanship. It was a sunstone, a gem that pulsed with a warm golden light that perfectly matched the hue of my lunar aura. The gold chain was delicate, yet looked strong enough to hold back a storm. "This belonged to the first queen of Athelgard," he whispered, lifting the necklace from its bed. "They say it only shines when it is near a soul that possesses the true light of the moon. I have watched it sit in the vaults, cold and dark, for my entire life." He stepped behind me, his hand steady as he moved my hair to one side. I felt the cool metal of the chain settle against my skin, and the moment the sunstone touched my chest, it erupted in a brilliant, steady glow. The light wasn't just visual, it was a physical warmth that spread through my limbs, grounding me. "This isn't just jewelry, Elsa," he murmured, his breath fanning against my ear. "It is a promise. It is a sign to every person in this fortress that you are under my protection. But more than that, it is a reminder to you that you are not some servant I rescued from a ravine. You are my equal." I looked at my reflection in the dark glass of the window, seeing the way the stone illuminated the silver flecks in my eyes. For the first time, I didn't see a runt or a victim of the shadow spire. I saw a woman who carried the light of a kingdom. Ragnar turned me around, his hands resting on my shoulders, his gaze heavy with a devotion that made my breath catch. He didn't ask for a thank you. He simply watched me, as if the sight of the stone against my skin was the only reward he required. "Wear it always," he commanded, though the edge of the order was softened by his touch. "As long as you wear this, my wolf will always be able to find you, no matter how deep the shadows become." Chapter 12. The Rival's Insult. The Council of Alphas was a den of vipers, and today the venom was particularly potent. We were gathered in the strategy room, a circular chamber where a massive map of the territories was projected onto a stone table via ancient light crystals. Ragnar sat at the head, his face a mask of iron, while the various leaders of the outer packs debated the security of the borders. I sat just behind him, a silent observer whose presence clearly irritated several of the men in the room. They didn't like that a commoner was privy to their secrets, and they liked even less that the king's attention often strayed to me whenever I shifted in my seat. The tension reached its breaking point when Alpha Torin, a massive scarred man from the Iron Ridge pack, slammed his fist onto the table. He had been arguing for a more aggressive stance against the human border towns, a move Ragnar had flatly refused. Torin's eyes shifted to me, his lip curling in a sneer that revealed his yellowed teeth. "Perhaps our sovereign is too distracted by his new pet to see the logic of war," Torin barked, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "We are warriors, and we are being led by a man who spends his nights coddling a low-born runt from the mud of the Shadowspire. Tell me, King, does she provide more than just a soft bed, or has she truly cast a spell on your common sense?" The room went so silent, I could hear the flickering of the torches. I felt the heat of embarrassment rise in my cheeks, the old feeling of being small and defenseless threatening to swallow me. I gripped the sunstone at my neck, my knuckles turning white. But before I could even pro-Elsa the insult, the air in the room seemed to vanish. Ragnar didn't yell. He didn't growl. He simply stood up, and the sheer weight of his presence was enough to make the other alphas move their chairs back in fear. He moved with a speed that the eye couldn't track, and in the next heartbeat, he was standing directly in front of Torin. Ragnar's hand shot out, his fingers wrapping around Torin's throat with enough force to lift the massive alpha onto his toes. The sound of Torin's gasping was the only noise in the chamber. "You speak of her as if you are worthy of breathing the same air," Ragnar said, his voice a terrifying, quiet rasp that made the hair on my arms stand up. "You think her birth defines her? Her soul brought me back from the threshold of death while you were likely cowering in your mountains. She is the future queen of this nation, and you are nothing but a barking dog who has forgotten his place." With a flick of his wrist, Ragnar slammed Torin down onto the stone floor. "Kneel," he commanded, the word carrying the full weight of his royal authority. Torin tried to resist, his muscles bulging, but Ragnar's aura was a physical crushing force that he couldn't fight. The Iron Ridge Alpha was forced down onto both knees, his head bowed in the dirt. "You will apologize to her," Ragnar growled, his hand resting on the hilt of his blade. "And you will do it now, or you will leave this room without your tongue." The other Alphas watched in absolute terror as Torin, humbled and broken, stuttered out a frantic apology to me. I realized then that Ragnar wasn't just protecting me. He was forcing the world to see me through his eyes. Chapter 13. The Shadow Rot Returns. The victory in the council room was short-lived. That evening, as the moon began its ascent, I felt a sudden cold shiver through our bond. It wasn't the usual protective hum of Ragnar's energy. It was a jagged, decaying vibration that felt like ice water in my veins. I ran to the royal suite, my heart hammering against my ribs. I found him in the center of the bedroom, his back arched in agony and his hands clawing at the fine silk of the bedsheets. The veins in his neck were standing out, pulsing with a dark, oily light. The sickness, the shadow rot that had nearly killed him in the ravine, was surging back with a vengeance. He let out a sound that was barely human, a mangled roar of pain and feral frustration. His eyes were shifting rapidly between their natural gold and a fractured, splintered black. "Elsa, get out," he wheezed, his body jerking as his wolf fought to take control. "The darkness, it's clawing its way back. I can't hold it." The air around him began to distort, a localized storm of negative energy that made the shadows in the corners of the room stretch and writhe like living things. He was losing himself to the madness that claimed all great Lycans, a primal rage that would turn him into a mindless monster if it wasn't stopped. I didn't listen to his command to leave. Instead, I stepped into the center of the storm. The pressure was intense, making it hard to breathe, but the sunstone at my neck was pulsing with a brilliant defensive light. I reached for him, my hands finding his face despite his attempts to push me away. His skin was burning hot, yet he was shivering with a bone-deep cold. I could feel the shadow rot trying to infect my own spirit, a greasy, sickening sensation that whispered of despair and violence. I pushed back against it, calling upon every ounce of the lunar aura I had within me. "Ragnar, look at me," I shouted over the sound of the wind that had somehow picked up inside the room. "Find my light. I am the anchor. You are not going into the dark." I pressed my forehead against his, closing my eyes and visualizing the golden tether that bound us together. I poured my energy into him, not as a kiss this time, but as a steady, unwavering flow of peace. I felt his wolf snap at me, a mental snarl of pure aggression, but I didn't flinch. I wrapped my soul around his, absorbing the jagged edges of his pain and replacing them with the calm of the silver mist forest. Slowly, the violent tremors began to subside. The dark light in his veins faded, replaced by the steady, healthy glow of his own power. He slumped against me, his heavy head falling onto my shoulder as he let out a long, broken breath. The room went still, the shadows returning to their proper places. We stayed like that for a long time, me holding the weight of the king as his heartbeat returned to a normal rhythm. He was safe, but the realization hit me with a terrifying clarity. The ambush hadn't just been a physical attack. The poison was rooted in his very soul, and I was the only thing standing between him and a fate worse than death. Chapter 14. Vulnerability in the Dark. The hours following the attack were spent in a hushed, fragile silence. Ragnar was too weak to move to the bed, so we stayed on the thick rugs by the hearth, the fire casting long, dancing shadows across his pale face. I had brought him water infused with calming herbs, and he drank it slowly, his hands still trembling slightly. The terrifying sovereign of the afternoon was gone, replaced by a man who looked haunted by the ghosts of his own mind. He wouldn't let go of my hand, his grip so tight it was almost painful, as if he feared that the moment he released me, the darkness would rush back in to fill the void. "It's been like this for years," he whispered, his voice so low I had to lean in to hear him. "Long before the ambush. It starts as a whisper in the back of my mind. A reminder that I am a monster, that I am destined to tear down everything I have built. The stronger the Lycan, the louder the shadow speaks." He looked at the fire, the flames reflecting in his golden eyes. "I've watched my father and his father before him succumb to it. I thought I was next. I had accepted it. I was just waiting for the day I would have to ask Draven to put a silver blade through my heart before I killed my own people." I reached out, smoothing the hair back from his forehead. The intimacy of his confession was more overwhelming than the bond itself. He was showing me the one thing he could never show the world: his fear. "You aren't them, Ragnar," I said softly. "You have something they didn't have." He looked at me then, a sad, knowing smile touching his lips. "I have you," he murmured. "A girl from a pack that didn't even know your name, and yet you carry the only power in the world that can quiet the beast. It's a cruel joke of the universe, isn't it? The king of the world, saved by the one person the world told him was nothing." We talked until the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows. He told me about his childhood, about the weight of a crown he never asked for, and the loneliness of a life where every touch was a transaction of power. I told him about the forest, about the way the moss feels after a rain, and the quiet joy of finding a rare flower in a hidden ravine. For those few hours, we weren't a king and a lunar aura. We were just two people who had found a strange, unexpected sanctuary in each other. It was the most romantic night of my life, devoid of grand gestures, built entirely on the foundation of shared truth. As the sun finally rose, Ragnar pulled me closer, his strength finally beginning to return. He kissed my palm, his lips warm and lingering. "I don't just want you for the healing, Elsa," he said, his voice regaining its depth. "I want the girl who wasn't afraid to step into the storm. I want the woman who saw the monster and didn't run." I felt a tear slide down my cheek, a mix of relief and a burgeoning love I was finally brave enough to acknowledge. But as the morning bell tolled, signaling the start of the court day, I felt a sudden sharp prick of unease. The peace was beautiful, but it was a thin veil over a pit of vipers, and I knew the darkness wasn't finished with us yet. Chapter 15. General Draven's Trap. The rumors began to spread like a wildfire through the Citadel's lower levels before the sun was even at its zenith. By the time I walked to the herbalist gardens, the servants were whispering behind their hands, their eyes darting away whenever I looked in their direction. They weren't whispering about the king's recovery anymore. They were whispering about a spy in the royal wing. They were saying that the Shadow Spire had sent me not to heal the king, but to bewitch him, that my lunar aura was nothing more than a dark enchantment designed to weaken his mind so my pack could seize control of the borders. It was a calculated, vicious lie, and I knew exactly who had started it. I was heading back to the suite when a hand caught my arm, pulling me into the shadows of a stone alcove. I gasped, my hand flying to the sunstone, but it wasn't a guard. It was General Draven. He was dressed in his full military regalia, his silver medals catching the dim light of the corridor. He didn't look angry. He looked amused, like a cat playing with a mouse it had already cornered. He didn't let go of my arm, his fingers digging into my skin with a cold, clinical pressure. "You've caused quite a stir, little healer," he said, his voice a silken purr of malice. "The court is a delicate ecosystem, and you are a parasite that is currently draining its host." "I am not a parasite," I spat, trying to wrench my arm away, but he was too strong. "I saved him. I am the only reason he is standing." Draven laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "And that is exactly the problem," He depends on you. A king who depends on a girl like you is a king who can be manipulated. The alphas are already talking of a vote of no confidence. They won't follow a man who is being led around by a runt. He leaned in closer, his scent of iron and bitter herbs making my head spin. But I am a reasonable man, Elsa. I can make this all go away. I can ensure your safety and give you more gold than your entire pack has ever seen. He reached into his coat and produced a heavy, clinking bag. Take this, he whispered. There is a carriage waiting at the eastern gate. Leave now. Go back to your woods, disappear into the shadows where you belong, and I will tell the king that you were a spy who fled when she was discovered. He will hate you, yes, but he will remain a king. If you stay, you will be the reason he loses his throne, and possibly his life. I looked at the gold, then at the cold, dead eyes of the man before me. He wasn't trying to save Ragnar. He was trying to isolate him. He wanted me gone because I was the only thing Draven couldn't control. I looked him straight in the eye, my voice steady despite the terror thrumming in my veins. He would never believe your lies, I said, my grip tightening on the sunstone. He knows my heart better than you ever will. Draven's expression shifted, the amusement vanishing, replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. He leaned in so close his cold breath hissed against my skin. We shall see about that, little girl. You think a fated bond can survive the weight of a kingdom in revolt? I have planted seeds that you cannot even imagine. By the time the midnight gala arrives, you won't be a queen. You'll be a corpse. He released me with a violent shove, leaving me gasping in the dark as he vanished into the corridor. Chapter 16. The Dance of the Lunar Aura. The grand ballroom of the Ethelgard Citadel was a cavernous space of white marble and arched ceilings, currently empty save for the two of us and the flickering light of 100 candles. The midnight gala was only days away, an event meant to solidify Ragnar's reign, and, as I was beginning to realize, my place beside him. But the grace required for such an occasion felt foreign to a girl who had spent her life navigating the uneven floor of a forest. My feet felt heavy, and the silence of the room was a pressure that made my skin itch. Draven's threats from the corridor still echoed in my mind, a dark poison that tainted the beauty of the shimmering floors. I was terrified that one wrong step would not only humiliate me, but provide the opening my enemies needed to tear Ragnar down. Ragnar stood in the center of the room, his presence grounding and immense. He had discarded his heavy royal overcoat, standing in a simple black shirt with the sleeves rolled up to reveal the powerful muscles of his forearms. He watched me with an expression that was both patient and intensely focused. "The court is a dance, Elsa," he said, his voice a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through the very soles of my feet. "It is about rhythm, presence, and the unspoken communication between partners. If you can master the movement, you can master the room. They will look for a reason to see you as less than you are, but we will give them nothing but perfection." He walked toward me, the distance between us closing with a predatory grace that never failed to make my heart hammer against my ribs. He reached out, taking my right hand in his while his other hand settled firmly against the small of my back. The contact was electric, a surge of warmth traveling through the sunstone at my neck and spreading into my chest. I felt the lunar aura within me respond to his touch, a soft, golden hum that began to sync with the steady thrum of his own pulse. I looked up at him, my breath hitching as I saw the raw devotion in his golden eyes. For a moment, the fear of the coming gala and the shadows of the coup were pushed to the periphery of my mind. "Follow my lead," he whispered, his head bowing until his lips were inches from mine. He began to move, a slow, sweeping glide that forced me to trust his strength. At first I was stiff, my movements jerky as I worried about the placement of my feet. But Ragnar didn't let go. He pulled me closer, his hand on my back guiding me with a firm, undeniable pressure. "Don't look at your feet, Elsa. Look at me. Feel the tether between us. Our souls already know how to move together. Your body just needs to catch up." I did as he asked, focusing on the dark depths of his gaze, and slowly, the world began to blur. The rhythm of the dance became a physical thing, a language of tension and release. I felt as though we were no longer two separate people, but a single entity moving in perfect harmony. The golden energy between us flared, illuminating the space around us with a soft, ethereal light. It was a private rehearsal, but it felt like a sacred ritual. We moved faster, the turns becoming more fluid, the distance between our bodies narrowing until I could feel every line of his muscular frame against mine. The romance was a heavy, intoxicating weight in the room, a promise of a future that felt almost within reach. But as the final notes of a silent melody played in my head, Ragnar spun me out and then pulled me back into a sharp, breath-stealing embrace. His eyes were no longer just gold. They held a possessive fire that made my soul ache. We were in perfect sync, two halves of a whole, but as I looked past his shoulder at the dark shadows of the balcony, I saw a single silver-clad figure watching us from the darkness. The figure vanished the moment I made eye contact, leaving behind a cold, biting chill that reminded me that our dance was being watched by those who wished to see it end in blood. Chapter 17. The Secret of the Runt. The library of the Citadel was a labyrinth of ancient stone and towering shelves that smelled of dust, old leather, and secrets. While Ragnar dealt with the logistics of the gala, I sought refuge here, driven by a desperate need to understand the power that had awakened inside me. I had been called a runt and a commoner my entire life, yet the energy that had saved the king felt like something ancient and formidable. I spent hours poring over crumbling scrolls and heavy silver-bound tomes, my fingers tracing the faded ink of a history that the Shadowspire had never bothered to teach. The more I read, the more I realized that the history of my kind was far more complex than a simple hierarchy of strength. Deep in the restricted archives, tucked behind a collection of military strategies, I found a small, unassuming book bound in white wolfskin. The pages were vellum, so thin they were almost translucent. As I opened it, the sunstone around my neck began to pulse with a rhythmic, insistent light. The text was written in an archaic dialect of the Lycan tongue, one that spoke of the first era of the moon. My eyes widened as I translated the passages, the words leaping off the page with a terrifying clarity. It spoke of the lunar aura, a rare and sacred lineage of shifters who appeared only when the Lycan bloodline was in danger of being consumed by the primal madness of the great wolves. The one the world names a runt is often the vessel of the moon's purest light, the text read, the ink shimmering under my touch. To the eyes of the many, they appear small and of no account, their beasts quiet and their strength hidden. But they are the descendants of the first healer, the ones born to be the anchor for the sovereigns. My heart skipped a beat as the realization washed over me. I wasn't a mistake or a fluke of nature. The very traits that had made me an outcast in my pack, my small stature, my quiet wolf, my sensitivity to the earth, were the hallmarks of a power that had been dormant for centuries. The text continued, describing the role of the Lunar Queen not as a consort, but as the king's ultimate protector. It explained that while the king held the power of the sun and the sword, the lunar aura held the power of the soul. Without the anchor, the king would eventually succumb to the shadow rot, his mind fracturing under the weight of his own power. I was the only thing that could keep Ragnar human. I wasn't just his mate. I was his survival. The kiss of life hadn't just been a transfer of energy. It had been the awakening of a bond that was designed to save an entire race from the feral darkness. I felt a surge of empowerment that I had never known before. All the years of being mocked, of being treated as someone who could be discarded, felt like a distant, faded memory. I wasn't weak. I was the most vital piece of the kingdom's defense. I closed the book, my hands trembling with the weight of this new knowledge. I understood now why Draven was so intent on removing me. He didn't just want the throne, he wanted the king to fall into madness so that he could rule over the ruins. If he could eliminate the anchor, the sovereign would inevitably destroy himself. I stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the stone floor, echoing through the silent library. I needed to find Ragnar. I needed to tell him what I had discovered, to warn him that the threat was far greater than a political coup. But as I turned to leave the archives, I realized I wasn't alone. The shadows between the shelves seemed to thicken, a cold mist beginning to roll across the floor. I gripped the sunstone, the light from the gem struggling to pierce the gathering gloom. A soft, mocking laugh echoed from the darkness, a sound that made my blood run cold. I wasn't just a protector, I was a target, and the hunt had officially begun. Chapter 18. A Jealous Flame. The day of the midnight gala arrived with a frantic energy that made the entire citadel feel like it was vibrating. I had been confined to the royal suite for my own safety, with Ragnar's most trusted guards posted at every entrance. My gown for the evening had been delivered earlier, a beautiful piece of silk the color of a dawn sky, a gift from the king that made me feel like I belonged in his world. I had left it draped over a chair while I went to the bathing chambers, trying to calm my nerves before the most important night of my life. But when I returned, my heart shattered into 1,000 pieces at the sight that greeted me. The dress was a ruin. The silk had been shredded into jagged strips, the delicate embroidery torn away and scattered across the floor like dead leaves. It wasn't just damaged, it had been systematically destroyed with a malice that felt personal. Standing in the center of the room was a young woman I recognized from the court, Lyra, the daughter of General Draven. She held a pair of silver shears in her hand, her face twisted in a sneer of pure, unadulterated jealousy. She didn't look afraid. She looked triumphant, as if destroying a piece of fabric would somehow erase my existence from the palace. "You think a pretty dress makes you a queen?" Lyra spat, her voice dripping with the same venom as her father's. "You are a gutter wolf, Elsa, a runt who crawled out of the mud to steal a place that doesn't belong to you. My father has spent years preparing me to take the throne at Ragnar's side. We will not let a commoner who smells of herbs and dirt ruin everything we have built." She dropped the shears, the metal clattering loudly on the marble. "Go ahead, cry to your king. Tell him that the world knows you for what you truly are. By the time the gala begins, you will be nothing but a memory." I didn't cry. The old Elsa might have shrunk away, might have accepted the humiliation as her due. But the woman who carried the lunar aura felt a different kind of heat rising in her chest. It wasn't sadness. It was a quiet, steady flame of defiance. I looked at the ruined silk, then back at the girl who thought she could break me with such a small cruelty. "You think my value is in a dress, Lyra?" I asked, my voice surprisingly steady. "You think Ragnar looks at me and sees a gown? You are as blind as your father. You can destroy every silk in this fortress, but you will never be the one who can quiet the storm in his mind." The doors to the suite flew open, and Ragnar stepped in, his presence immediately filling the room with a dangerous, heavy energy. He looked from the shredded dress to the girl standing in the middle of the room, and the air seemed to freeze. Lyra's triumphant expression vanished, replaced by a mask of terror as she realized the depth of the king's fury. Ragnar didn't say a word to her. He simply pointed to the door. 2 guards moved forward, seizing Lyra by the arms and dragging her out of the room as she began to scream for her father. Ragnar walked over to me, his hands shaking as he looked at the ruin of his gift. He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw, his eyes searching mine for any sign of the runt who could be broken. "I am so sorry, Elsa," he whispered, his voice thick with a raw, protective ache. "I thought you were safe here." I looked at him, shaking my head. "It's just fabric, Ragnar. It doesn't matter." He went silent for a moment, then a slow, predatory smile touched his lips. He walked over to a hidden cabinet in the wall, pulling out a box I hadn't seen before. Inside was a gown of liquid silver, a garment that looked as though it had been woven from the moonlight itself. "Let them see you now," he growled. "Let them see the woman who owns the king." Chapter 19. The Midnight Gala. The entrance to the grand ballroom was a wall of light and sound that felt like a physical barrier. As the heavy doors swung open, the chatter of hundreds of high-ranking shifters died down into a deafening silence. I stood at the top of the grand staircase, my hand resting on Ragnar's arm. The gown of liquid silver clung to my form, shimmering with every breath I took, and the sunstone at my neck was a steady, golden beacon. Ragnar was dressed in his full royal regalia, his crown of dark iron and silver sitting atop his head, his gaze fixed forward with a regal, untouchable coldness. We descended the stairs slowly, every eye in the room tracking our movement. I could feel the waves of judgment, curiosity, and outright hostility coming from the crowd, but for the first time, it didn't make me want to hide. The knowledge of my lineage was a shield around my heart. I wasn't a commoner being allowed into their space. I was the anchor they all relied upon, whether they knew it or not. Ragnar's hand was a warm, solid weight on mine, his thumb tracing small circles on my skin. A private communication of support that made me feel as though we were the only two people in the universe. The music began, a sweeping orchestral melody that signaled the start of the royal dance. Ragnar led me to the center of the floor, the other couples parting like a sea before a storm. As we began to move, I felt the familiar rhythm we had practiced in the empty ballroom. But tonight, it was different. There was a desperate electric edge to our movements. The public claim was a declaration of war against our enemies. Every turn, every lingering touch was a message to Draven and his followers. I am hers, and she is mine. The golden energy of the lunar aura began to bleed into the air, a soft glow that made the silver of my gown look like it was truly alive. "You are breathtaking," Ragnar whispered, his voice a low vibration that only I could hear. "They can't even look away. You have stolen the heart of this kingdom in a single night." I looked up at him, my heart overflowing with a love that felt as ancient as the mountain itself. "I only want to be the heart of your world, Ragnar," I replied. We spun through the room, the world blurring into a kaleidoscope of color and light. For a few perfect minutes, I allowed myself to believe that we had won, that the sheer power of our bond would be enough to sweep away the darkness that had been hounding us. The dance reached its climax, and Ragnar pulled me into a deep, final dip, his face inches from mine as the crowd erupted into a mix of applause and stunned silence. It was a moment of pure cinematic romance, a triumph of the spirit over the hierarchy of the court. But as he pulled me back to my feet, the celebratory atmosphere was punctured by a sudden jarring sound, the shattering of a massive glass carafe at the edge of the ballroom. A thick, greenish-silver gas began to pour out of the broken vessel, spreading across the floor with an unnatural speed. I saw Draven standing by the pillars, a gas mask already covering his face, his eyes glinting with a murderous triumph. "The king is dead!" he shouted, his voice muffled but carrying across the room. "Long live the new order!" Panic erupted as the shifters near the gas began to cough and collapse, their wolves suppressed by the toxins. Ragnar tried to pull me toward the exit, but his movements were suddenly sluggish, his eyes clouding over as the silver gas reached our position. He let out a strangled groan, his knees buckling as the poison struck his already weakened system. I caught him, the weight of the sovereign pulling me down to the marble floor as the shadows closed in from every side. Chapter 20. The Coup of Shadows. The ballroom, once a place of light and music, was transformed into a nightmare of choking mist and terrified screams. The silver gas was a heavy, cloying fog that clung to the floor, acting like a spiritual anchor that dragged the shifters down into a state of paralyzed weakness. It was a specialized toxin, designed specifically to target the connection between a Lycan and their wolf. All around us, the elite warriors of the Ethelgard court were falling like wheat before a scythe, their eyes rolling back as they struggled to breathe. I, however, felt a strange burning clarity. The lunar aura within me was reacting to the poison, forming a protective barrier that kept the worst of the gas from my lungs. Ragnar lay in my arms, his face a mask of agony. His skin was turning a sickly, ashen gray, and the dark light of the shadow rot was beginning to flare in his veins again, triggered by the suppressant. He was trying to speak, his hand clawing at my arm, but he was too weak to form words. The silence of his wolf was the most terrifying thing of all. The constant grounding hum of his presence had been replaced by a void. I looked up to see Draven's men, soldiers who had betrayed their oaths, moving through the mist with cold, clinical precision, finishing off anyone who tried to resist. Draven himself walked toward us, his boots clicking rhythmically on the marble. He looked down at the fallen king with a disgust that was palpable. "A pathetic end for a supreme sovereign," he said, his voice echoing through the chaos. "To fall not on a battlefield, but in the middle of a dance floor, clutching a girl who can't even hold a sword." He drew his blade, the silver metal gleaming with a lethal light. "I told you, Elsa. I told you that you would be the reason he loses his life. Your presence made him soft, made him believe that a mate was more important than the crown. Now, you get to watch as I take everything he ever loved." I felt a cold, hard resolve settle in my chest. The fear that had defined my life for so long was gone, replaced by a fierce maternal protectiveness for the man dying in my lap. I realized that the silver gas wasn't just a toxin. It was a manifestation of the shadow rot, a weapon built on the very darkness I was born to fight. I stood up slowly, the sunstone at my neck beginning to glow with a light so intense it started to push back the greenish mist. I didn't have a sword, and I didn't have the strength of a warrior, but I had the power of the first healers. "You won't touch him," I said, my voice resonating with a power that made the soldiers nearby pause. The lunar aura wasn't just a healing touch anymore. It was a weapon of pure light. I felt the energy surging out of me, a golden tide that began to neutralize the gas where it touched. Draven's eyes widened in shock as the mist started to dissipate around me, the light from my spirit creating a sanctuary of clear air in the middle of the ballroom. He snarled, raising his sword to strike, but I didn't flinch. I reached out, my hands glowing with the heat of 1,000 suns. "I am the Lunar Queen," I declared, the words carrying a weight that shook the very foundation of the mountain. "And you have no power in my house." As I spoke, the golden light erupted from me in a massive, blinding shockwave, a physical manifestation of my soul's claim. The light slammed into Draven and his traitors, throwing them back against the walls. But as the energy left me, I felt a sudden, terrifying drain on my life force. I had pushed too hard, too fast. My vision began to blur at the edges, and as I looked down at Ragnar, I saw his eyes flutter open for a brief second, only to see him reach out toward me as the world finally went black. Chapter 21. The Healer's War. The world didn't stay dark for long, but the transition back to consciousness was a brutal assault of noise and heat. I forced my eyes open, my lungs burning as if I had swallowed shards of glass. The ballroom was still a graveyard of fallen shifters, but the green mist was thinning, shredded by the golden light that still radiated from my skin in fitful pulses. I was on my knees, my dress stained with the soot and blood of a palace turned into a slaughterhouse. Beside me, Ragnar was still motionless, his breath coming in shallow, wet rattles that terrified me more than the soldiers closing in on our position. I could feel his life force flickering like a candle in a gale, the shadow rot seizing its chance to finally extinguish the great Lycan king. Draven was picking himself up from the far wall, his face a mask of bloody fury. The shockwave had cracked the marble behind him, and one of his eyes was swollen shut, but he still held his silver blade. He looked at me not with fear, but with a fanatical, twisted hatred. He gestured to the remaining traitors, men who had shaken off the stun of my blast and were now drawing their sidearms. "Kill her!" he screamed, his voice cracking with desperation. "Forget the king! Kill the girl first! She is the source of the light! If she falls, he dies with her!" I didn't have a weapon. I didn't have the training of a warrior. But as I watched the soldiers step forward, their boots crunching on the broken glass, I felt a resonance deep in my marrow. It was the ancient memory of the lunar aura, a power that wasn't just meant to mend flesh, but to protect the sanctuary of the soul. I reached out and placed one hand on Ragnar's chest and the other palm facing the approaching men. I didn't try to push them away with force this time. Instead, I imagined the kiss of life expanding, a bubble of pure, revitalizing energy that acted as a shield against everything that was unnatural and poisonous. A barrier of shimmering gold erupted around us, a dome of light that hummed with the frequency of a celestial bell. When the first soldier fired his crossbow, the silver bolt didn't pierce the light. It simply disintegrated into dust the moment it touched the perimeter. The men stopped, their faces pale as they realized they were facing a power they couldn't calculate or conquer. I felt the drain on my spirit, a heavy, dragging exhaustion that threatened to pull me under. But I locked my jaw. I looked at Draven through the translucent gold of my shield, and for the first time in my life, I felt the terrifying weight of my own authority. "You speak of strength as if it only belongs to those who carry steel," I said, my voice echoing through the chamber with a clarity that cut through the remaining fog. "But you have forgotten that the moon governs the tides and the hearts of all living things. You brought your rod into this house, and now you will see it burned away." I focused all my intent on the mark on my collarbone, drawing the energy directly from the bond. I wasn't just a healer anymore. I was the firewall between my mate and the abyss. I poured the light into the floor, sending ripples of golden heat across the marble that sought out the silver gas and neutralized it on contact. As the air cleared, I felt a change in the man beneath my hand. Ragnar's heart gave a sudden, powerful lurch, and the gray tint of his skin began to dissolve, replaced by a fierce, healthy bronze. The shadow rot that had been clawing at his mind met the full force of my aura and recoiled, scorched by a purity it couldn't survive. I felt him move, his large hand coming up to cover mine on his chest. The touch was no longer weak. It was the grip of a predator who had just been handed back his life. He looked up at me, his eyes no longer fractured but glowing with a solid, terrifying gold that promised a reckoning the kingdom would never forget. Chapter 22. The King's Wrath. The heat radiating from Ragnar was no longer the fever of a dying man. It was the furnace of a god-tier predator reclaiming his throne. He stood up with a slow, deliberate grace that sent a wave of visible terror through the ranks of the traitors. I stumbled back, my legs finally giving out as the exhaustion of the healer's war took its toll. But he caught me with one arm, pulling me against his side. His touch was a grounding force, a pillar of absolute strength that kept me from collapsing into a heap of silver silk and spent energy. He didn't look at me yet. His focus was entirely on the man who had dared to bring poison into his sanctuary. "Draven," Ragnar said, and the name sounded like a death sentence. The sound wasn't loud, but it carried to every corner of the ballroom, vibrating in the very stone of the mountain. He stepped forward, releasing me only when he was sure I could stand. The golden light of my aura was still clinging to him, weaving through his dark hair and illuminating the scars on his chest. The shadow rot was gone, purged by the intensity of our combined bond, leaving behind a version of the king that was more powerful than anything the histories had ever recorded. He didn't even draw a sword. He didn't need one. Draven tried to strike, a desperate lunging motion with his silver blade aimed at Ragnar's throat. The king didn't flinch. He moved with a speed that made the general look like he was moving through water, his hand snapping out to catch Draven's wrist. The sound of bone shattering echoed through the silent room, followed by the clatter of the silver sword hitting the floor. Draven let out a strangled cry of agony, but Ragnar didn't let go. He leaned in, his face inches from the traitors, his golden eyes burning with a righteous, unshakable fury. "You thought I was weak because I chose to find peace," Ragnar growled, his voice a low-frequency rumble that made the remaining traitors drop their weapons in surrender. "You thought my mate was a liability because she didn't come from a line of warriors. You were wrong. She is the only reason you are still breathing long enough to see your legacy turn to ash." He didn't give Draven a chance to respond. With a surge of raw, Lycan power, he threw the general across the room, the man's body hitting the heavy stone pillars with a sickening thud. Draven collapsed, broken and defeated, his dreams of a coup dying in the shadows of the very throne he had tried to steal. The royal guard, those who had been paralyzed by the gas but were now recovering thanks to the purge of the air, swarmed the room. They moved with a renewed ferocity, seizing the traitors and securing the exits. The transition from chaos back to order was swift and merciless. Ragnar stood in the center of the destruction, the undisputed sovereign once more. He looked around the room, his gaze lingering on the fallen warriors and the terrified nobles, and then he finally turned back to me. The murderous light in his eyes vanished instantly, replaced by a look of such profound, raw vulnerability that it made my heart ache. He crossed the distance between us in a single stride, his hands framing my face with a tenderness that defied his terrifying display of power. He looked for any injury, his thumbs tracing the line of my jaw as if he couldn't believe I was still there. "Elsa," he whispered, his voice cracking. "You did it. You fought the darkness for me." I reached up, covering his hands with mine, the warmth of the sunstone still pulsing between us. The obsidian decay was a memory, the threat was neutralized, and for the first time since I had found him in that ravine, the weight of the world felt like it had finally been lifted. But as the guards began to clear the bodies, I saw a flicker of doubt in his gaze that told me our journey wasn't quite over. Chapter 23. More Than a Debt. The days following the midnight gala were a blur of reconstruction and quiet recovery. The citadel was being scrubbed of the traitor's influence, and the story of the runt queen who had saved the king twice over was already becoming a legend that stretched far beyond the mountain peaks. I spent most of my time in the high gardens, finding peace in the familiar scent of herbs and the steady growth of the star lilies. But today, the air was different. The silence of the palace felt heavy, as if the walls themselves were waiting for a final word to be spoken. I was sitting on our stone bench, watching the sunset bleed into the valley, when I heard the familiar, heavy tread of Ragnar's boots. He didn't come to stand over me this time. He sat down at the other end of the bench, leaving a deliberate space between us. He looked tired, the weight of the crown appearing heavier than it ever had during the height of the war. He was dressed in simple travel clothes, devoid of the silver mail and regal furs of the sovereign. He didn't look at me, his gaze fixed on the darkening horizon. "The council has finalized the sentences for Draven and his followers," he said, his voice level but devoid of its usual predatory edge. "The Shadow Spire has been disbanded. Your step-family has been exiled to the northern wastes. They will never trouble you again." I felt a surge of relief, but it was overshadowed by the strange distance in his tone. "Thank you, Ragnar," I whispered. He finally turned to look at me, and my heart skipped a beat at the sadness in his gold eyes. "By Lycan law, Elsa, you have more than paid the healer's debt. You saved my life, my mind, and my kingdom. You have given me everything, and I have given you nothing but danger and a life you never asked for." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small iron key and a scroll bearing the royal seal. He placed them on the bench between us. "This is the deed to a manor in the southern valley, near the Silver Mist Forest but far from the reach of the court. he explained, his voice growing tight. "It is filled with the finest gardens in the realm. You will have a pension that will keep you in luxury for the rest of your life. You are free, Elsa. The bond, it is a powerful thing, but I will not use it to keep you in a cage of silk. I want you to have the choice I never had." He stood up, his tall frame silhouetted against the dying light. "If you wish to leave, the carriage is ready at the gate. I will tell the world that you are my most honored advisor, living in well-earned peace." The realization hit me like a physical blow. He thought he was doing me a favor. He thought that because he was a monster and a king, I could only ever be with him out of duty or the force of the fated bond. He didn't understand that the girl who had gathered herbs in the mud was the same woman who had stood in the center of a magical storm for him. I stood up, the chair scraping loudly, and stepped into his space, forcing him to look at me. I didn't reach for the key or the deed. I reached for his hand, lacing my fingers through his and feeling the familiar, electric thrum of our connection. "You think I stayed because of a debt?" I asked, my voice trembling with a mix of anger and love. "You think I fought the shadow rot because a law told me to?" I pulled his hand up and pressed it against the sunstone at my neck, which flared with a brilliant, golden heat in response. "I didn't give you the kiss of life to save a king, Ragnar. I gave it to save the man who made the world feel quiet for the first time in my life. I don't want a manor in the valley. I don't want to be an advisor." I looked him straight in the eyes, my soul laid bare. "I want to be exactly where I am. I want to stay because I love you, not because the moon told me I had to." Chapter 24. The Coronation of the Heart. The day of the final ceremony was nothing like the midnight gala. There were no masks, no hidden poisons, and no green mist lurking in the shadows. The entire nation had gathered at the base of the Ethelgard mountain, a sea of shifters from every pack, including those who had once looked down upon the Shadow Spire with nothing but disdain. The air was crisp and clear, filled with the scent of wildflowers and the distant, rhythmic drumming of 100 wolf hearts beating in unison. I stood on the high dais, dressed in a gown of pure white silk that seemed to absorb the morning sunlight, my hair braided with the silver ferns I used to harvest as a girl. Ragnar stood before me, but he wasn't wearing his crown. He had handed it to his lead commander, standing before his people as a man first and a king second. The silence that fell over the crowd was absolute, a heavy, reverent hush that spanned the entire valley. He took my hands in his, and the moment our skin met, the lunar aura erupted in a gentle, shimmering wave that washed over the front rows of the audience. It wasn't a show of force. It was a blessing, a physical manifestation of the peace we had fought so hard to secure. Ragnar looked at me, and the devotion in his eyes was so bright it made my vision blur with tears. "To my people, I am a sovereign," Ragnar's voice boomed, carried by the wind to the furthest reaches of the assembly. "I have led you with a cold heart and a sharp sword, believing that strength was the only way to survive. But I was dying in the dark until a girl from the shadows brought me back to the light." He slowly lowered himself to one knee, a move that sent a collective gasp through the thousands of shifters watching. The Supreme Sovereign, a man who had never bowed to anyone, was kneeling in the dirt before a woman the world had once called a runt. "Elsa of the Silver Mist, you are not just my mate. You are my queen, my anchor, and my soul. I belong to you as much as you belong to me." He reached out and took the lunar crown, a delicate, shifting circle of moonstone and sunstone, and placed it on my head. As the metal touched my brow, the bond between us solidified into something indestructible, a golden bridge that would span the rest of our lives. I looked out over the kingdom and saw not judgment, but hope. They saw a queen who understood the value of quiet places, a woman who knew that true power didn't come from the size of a wolf, but from the resilience of the heart. I reached down and pulled Ragnar to his feet, my fingers tangling in the dark hair at the nape of his neck as I brought his lips to mine. The kiss was the final seal, a public promise that echoed the one we had made in the silence of the ravine. It wasn't a kiss of life to save a dying man. It was a kiss of love to begin a new era. The crowd erupted into a roar of approval that shook the mountain, a sound of joy that replaced the screams of the coup. As we eventually pulled apart, Ragnar leaned in, his forehead resting against mine, his breath warm and steady. The obsidian decay was gone, the traitors were a memory, and the future was a vast, open horizon that we would navigate together. We walked to the edge of the balcony, looking out over a kingdom that was finally at peace. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the world in shades of gold and violet. Ragnar wrapped his arm around my waist, pulling me back into the solid, protective heat of his chest. He took a deep breath, his nostrils flaring as he took in the scent of mint and wildflowers that still clung to me. He leaned down, his lips brushing against the mark on my collarbone one last time, before whispering a word that held the weight of 1,000 years. "Mine," he promised. And this time, it was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard.